Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. I've just been joined by quite a funny bloke.
Let me understand this, because maybe it's me, I'm a little up, maybe. But I'm funny how? I mean, funny like I'm a clown, I amuse you. I make you laugh. I'm here to fucking amuse you. What do you mean funny? Funny how? How am I funny? How the fuck am I funny? What the fuck is so funny about me? Tell me. Tell me what's funny.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always, has absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, development stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and an appreciation, really, that films somehow manage to get through the system. This episode is mildly different. It's half a standard episode and half a little bit of a special one. I'm going to start with a film story, I'm going to end with an interview, and I'm going to kick things off by taking us all the way back to 1990. I'm going to play you a clip, the trailer of the first part of the show, and then I'll come to the story of this, the other side.
Counselor, proceed.
Congratulations.
Here's your graduation present.
Listen, what for? I got pinched.
Everybody gets pinched, but you did it right. You told them nothing, and they got nothing.
I thought you'd be mad.
Man, I'm not mad. I'm proud of you. You took your first pinch like a man, and you learned the two greatest things in life.
What?
Look at me. Never rat on your friends, and always keep your mouth shut.
Hey, here he is.
Oh, you broke your cherry.
So that is a clip from 1990's Goodfellas, directed by Martin Scorsese. Screenplay, Nicholas Pileggi and Martin Scorsese, based on the novel Wise Guy, also by Nicholas Pileggi, starring Robert De Niro, Ray Liotta, Joe Pesci, Lorraine Bracco and Paul Sorvino, amongst an extensive ensemble cast. Story goes back to real-life gangster by the name of Henry Hill, who in 1990 would inspire two different movies based on his life. We're going to be talking about Goodfellas here, you've probably worked that out. His story also inspired the 1990 Nora Ephron comedy My Blue Heaven, starring Steve Martin and Rick Moranis. It's a really interesting double bill if you wanted to do it, if you ever want to do that. But it'd be fair to say, as we come to start this story, that Martin Scorsese, the acclaimed director, of course, was having a bit of a time as the 1980s went on. So, of course, he exploded onto the movie scene with, in particular, films such as Mean Streets and Taxi Driver and Raging Bull across the 1970s and into 1980. But he hadn't quite, for a few years, recaptured the response he'd been getting to his films. And it's not that the films were bad. 1982's The King of Comedy is now regarded as something of a flat-out classic and a minor template for the comic book movie Joker as well. But The King of Comedy was pretty much ignored at the time. And whilst he earned himself a useful box office hit with The Colour of Money in 1986, 1988's The Last Temptation of Christ, a real passion project for Martin Scorsese, put him at the heart of what you could fairly describe as a bit of a cultural meltdown over the film. Accusations of blasphemy, headlines around the world, protests against the movie, primarily from people who hadn't seen it, and Scorsese was absolutely in the midst of all of that. But even as he was taking The Last Temptation of Christ to the Venice Film Festival and navigating the moral crusade against the film that, again, most of the Crusaders hadn't actually watched, he already knew by that point where he was heading next, because he tried previously to get a film called Goodfellas going, although it wasn't quite called that at the time, but had struggled really to get the necessary interest to get the film going. And also there was a reticence on his part. Does he want to go back and do another gangster movie? Coming to that in a second. Now, it was during the shoot of The Colour of Money that he first became aware of the book Wise Guy from Nicholas Pileggi. Now, this book had started out as a piece for New York magazine and gradually became something bigger, and it was the story of a member of the mob, Henry Hill. And Scorsese and Pileggi met up after a while, and Pileggi quickly committed the book to Scorsese after Scorsese told him just how much he loved it. And Pileggi was very aware of the movie catalogue and Martin Scorsese as well. And even though more money was being offered elsewhere, Pileggi pledged his book, much to the chagrin of his agents, to Scorsese. Separately, a producer by the name of Irwin Winkler was one of those who was bidding for Wise Guy, but he soon learned that Scorsese was interested in directing it as well, and they all came together. That Winkler joined the project as a producer, Scorsese would direct, and this was a rare moment where competing parties ultimately were on the same side. So the story of Wise Guy and subsequently Goodfellas was of Henry Hill, the rise and fall of a gangster, and basically what gangsters needed to do to get by. Scorsese was intrigued and really taken with the story, but also he was wary. I mean, did he want to move back to the world of gangsters? He'd risen through the world of gangsters. He'd made a real cinematic footprint with his stories. But to go back, especially after all this time, was that the right path forward? Marlon Brando, for one, had warned him off doing another gangster picture because how are you going to improve on what you'd done before? There were reasons not to do it, but Michael Powell was a confidant of Scorsese and he expressed his concerns to him as well. But it's Powell that rang up and just read it and just said, you just have to do this. Now, Scorsese also had a hand in the eventual script as well. And so in the book Martin Scorsese, A Journey from Mary Pat Kelly, it talked there about the script being based on Wise Guy, and it's Nick's book, but the visual styling had to be completely redone in our writing sessions. So we decided to share credit, Scorsese explained. He hadn't at that point shared credit in quite the same way on a writing credit, at least on a movie. And he said it's the first script I've put my name on since Mean Streets. The name of the film would change to Goodfellas because there was a show called Wise Guys going around at the time. Irwin Winkler drops that in during his book as well. And so what happened is Pileggi broke down the story and broke it down into the scenes and the component parts, and he and Scorsese met many times. And this was all, a lot of this had happened before The Last Temptation of Christ, before Scorsese went off to make that picture. They were already in conversations about this being a film that Scorsese wanted to do. And so once Pileggi had broken it down, they penned whole bunches of notes and script and screenplay, and it took around a dozen meetings before they got the guts of their script together. Now, Scorsese had form in gangster film. I mean, Mean Streets, clearly, his breakthrough movie was embedded in this world. But here was a case of he was going to put a relatively expensive, by his standards, gangster film through top to bottom through the studio system. That this wasn't going to be made as an independent in any way. It was going to be set up as a studio. It was going to be made by studio, promoted by studio as well. And so at this point in his career, Scorsese was working with a famed agent by the name of Michael Ovitz. Mike Ovitz, who had headed up Creatist Artists Agency that he'd founded and run, and for a long time was ranked on Premiere Magazine's power list as the most powerful person in Hollywood, was notorious for being able to package movies together. He would take a script, he would take a director, he would take stars, he would walk into a studio and say, it's going to cost you this much, the movie's ready to go. So Ovitz had set up The Colour of Money for Scorsese at Disney, along with Scorsese's producer Barbara DeFina. And in the case of The Colour of Money, DeFina and Scorsese delivered that film on budget and early, and they found some gold working in a studio environment as well. So Ovitz was confident taking Goodfellas out to market, and so he pitched it around to a few places. Universal turned it down, but he found a home at Warner Brothers. Now, it helped that Ovitz was pitching it with the idea being that Tom Cruise and Madonna would take on the lead roles, that kind of packaging that he liked to do with his projects. Scorsese, however, he had very different ideas on the casting of the film. He'd bumped into Ray Liotta at the Venice Film Festival, had been really taken with his gait and the way he just went about things as well. And Liotta would say he wanted me to send him a tape of me and said that he would see me when I got back from Venice. And so after the pair met at the Venice Film Festival, Liotta said that night I went home and wrote a very honest letter telling him it was very nice meeting him. Here's the cassette, view it at your leisure. And a month and a half went by and I saw him walking through the lobby of a hotel. There were bodyguards around him and they had a conversation, and Scorsese was locking in on the idea of Ray Liotta taking one of the lead roles in what would become Goodfellas. Now, Ovitz knew that the casting would be changing. He wrote in his own book, Who is Michael Ovitz, about Universal turning it down. And part of the deal with Warner Brothers there were conditions, because this wasn't a big blockbuster movie, but however, it was going to need a fair amount of funds to be able to realise. Warner Brothers, however, would top the budget out at $25 million maximum. That was your lot. After that, you're on your own. And Warner Brothers also mandated a 140-minute running time. Ovitz took the deal, and he knew that, he knew that Scorsese liked Ray Liotta in Jonathan Demme's film Something Wild as well. He knew that Warner Brothers wouldn't be keen on that casting because Warner Brothers wanted at least one name in the film. In fact, in Ovitz's book, he reveals that one studio executive suggested Eddie Murphy as someone who could star in Goodfellas, but Scorsese was resistant to having star power in the movie as well. He felt that the story was strong enough, and if you had big star names, it would distract a little bit from him. So Irwin Winkler takes up the story in his book, A Life in Movies, and he said how he was in Chicago at one point on location for the film Music Box, which he made with Joe Esterhazy, when Barbara Defina said that Scorsese was getting impatient with the studio delays in giving Goodfellas the green light. Now, Scorsese rang up Winkler and reiterated his commitment to making Goodfellas, but there was another film he was interested in doing as well. Now, my chronology isn't entirely certain, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was the film of Schindler's List, or Schindler's Ark, as Thomas Keneally's book is known as, that for a while Scorsese was going to do before he swapped that project with Steven Spielberg and ended up making Cape Fear straight after Goodfellas, as it turned out. But Scorsese was a little bit hardballing. He was just floating the thing that there is another film I'll go and do if you don't want to do this. And Ovitz knew the warning sign there, and so he went straight to Terry Semel, one of the co-chairs of Warner Brothers at that point. And Semel said that the casting of Ray Liotta and Joe Pesci, and at that point the budget of $16 million, meant that he couldn't okay the film unless we had a major star for the other lead. And so Winkler described, after a lot of arguing, Semel said that if I gave him my word we would get a major star for the third role, he'd give Goodfellas the okay. And Winkler promised, yeah, okay. But really, at that stage, he had no idea who would take on the role of Jimmy Conway. Yet it was Scorsese who had the idea. And he got in touch with Robert De Niro. They'd worked successfully on a whole bunch of projects, even at that stage in their careers. They were looking for something to work on again. And De Niro agreed to take on what really the lightest in terms of screen time of the three lead roles in the film. Now, also in the running, apparently, for that role of Jimmy was Al Pacino. In fact, I've read at least one interview where it said that Pacino was offered that part before De Niro took it, but he turned it down, fearful of being typecast at this stage in his career. He'd done his fair share of gangster stuff as well. Ironically, he turned it down to play a gangster in Dick Tracy, if you believe one interview. And Liotta, I mean, just in terms of how superhero films were going at the time, had been offered a role in Batman by Warner Brothers, the role of Harvey Dent that Billy D. Williams also took on. If he had taken that on, it may have just clashed with the filming of Goodfellas, in that he would have had to been out and about promoting Batman at that stage. Scorsese was on board. Lorraine Bracco met up with Scorsese and they had a conversation. He offered her the role of Karen. Joe Pesci wasn't far behind, worked with Scorsese before, of course. And the further key to just getting Goodfellas over the line, which now had a budget and a studio, but was getting the supporting cast right. And so at a restaurant in Harlem called Rayo's, with the help of Nicholas Pileggi, they held open auditions for some of the supporting characters in the film. Now, to put this delicately, those open auditions required slightly less acting and slightly more experience of the job that was being portrayed on screen. If you are familiar with the film, you'll know where this is going. And as it turned out, as Tom Shon revealed in his book, Scorsese, the production in the end hired around half a dozen people who were new to acting and were fairly protective of their identities, to the point that when Warner Brothers looked to put them on payroll to pay their salaries for the film, they weren't entirely keen on giving their actual social security numbers and may have instead floated fake ones, which went through the system, and somehow they got their money. May the 3rd, 1989 then, that was the date that Goodfellas began filming, and Scorsese had built in a rehearsal time for his actors before the shoot would begin in earnest in and around the Queens, the New York State, the New Jersey area of America. That was where the production was going to be sited. And Scorsese, during that rehearsal time, was just getting his actors and his ensemble comfortable with some degree of improvisation. That even though he and Pileggi had nailed the script and they were happy with the script, the tone that he was going to look for Goodfellas was more of a documentary style. He wanted it not to be a documentary, but certainly in that kind of styling, even if not exactly so. He wanted to keep his camera busy for the shoot. This was going to be a fast film. He was particularly this has come up loads of times in interviews about the film. He was looking at the opening of the 1962 film Jules and Jim, and the way that that's edited so quickly, it gets its narration over quickly as well. And that was really what he was looking to go for. There were particular challenges during the shooting of the film as well. I mean, one of the most famous shots, one of the most brilliant shots in Goodfellas is a long Steadicam shot in the Copacabana nightclub where we see Ray Liotta and Lorraine Bracco walking from the back of the club to a table being presented, through the kitchen to a table being presented right at the front of proceedings. This was at a point where film cameras were carrying, 10, 11 minutes of film in the can as well. So each tracking shot, each time they were going to do this shot, they didn't have many takes before they had to change the magazine. It was ambitious and difficult, and the nightclub management didn't actually want them going through the front door anyway, so they designed this sequence of them going through the back, and 7, 8, 9 takes it was taking that. And it's a very kinetic scene as well. There are people coming in and out, and a couple of times they had to retake it when the stand-up comedian on stage just fluffed his lines just at the end of the take. You have to go right the way back to the start and begin it all over again. However, I think those of us who've seen the film would concede it's utterly worth it, all the effort that they put in to do it. There was a lot of space for improvised dialogue, and there was a lot of space to bring ideas to the film. That one of the reasons actually you have so many F-bombs in the film is they're not in the original screenplay. It's just the actors were just running with it, and Scorsese was happy to include them. It's a notorious film for having quite so much swearing in it. One of the key and most remembered scenes in the film as well, I played you a clip right at the start of this podcast, is the funny how moment with Joe Pesci. I mean, a masterpiece of 90s cinema, this. And it came from an idea that Joe Pesci brought. This also wasn't originally written in the screenplay they put together, but it was part of what Pesci brought to his character and an idea that they tried, and it would be fair to say it completely worked. There was interest from, again, I'm touching lightly because I live in abject fear, some of the organisations that may have been represented in the film as well. And going back to Tom Shon's Martin Scorsese book, Ileana Douglas, who takes on a role in the film, just said, well, let's just say we had a lot of set visits from certain people. He said there were a lot of people in the film where it was nudge, nudge, wink, wink, make sure she gets on camera, otherwise Local 19 is going to be a little upset with us. And she described it as a great sense of blurring the lines. I mean, it's hard not to see the parallel with Francis Ford Coppola shooting the Godfather movies at that particular point. Paul Sorvino, the late Paul Sorvino, takes on a memorable role as Paulie in the film. And I mean, it's interesting that he was struggling with that particular role. It's one of his most famous roles, but he was really concerned over the level of violence. In fact, he told the New York Times around the time, he just said, what I didn't know and what I wasn't sure I'd find was that kernel of coldness and absolute hardness that is antithetical to my nature, except when my family is threatened. And he described it how that just getting to that feeling took 2 months. And he said, I never thought I'd get it. But then one day I passed a mirror and startled myself, and he'd found the character and he'd found a way to manage the violence of the character and just the coldness of it in his head. He was also really praising as well as to how Scorsese made actors feel like they were the kings on the set. That Scorsese would turn up and know what he wanted, but he was working very, very closely with his actors, but not overburdening them. He was letting them bring their characters to the screen. And like many people who talk about being directed by Scorsese, he had nothing really but praise for him. Now, De Niro, of course, as you would expect, very much a man who gets into his character. He wanted realism. The suits were sublime that he wears in the film, for instance, and the level of authenticity goes right the way down to the money that you just see him handing around in the film. Because whereas every other actor was happy to hand around fake dollar bills, bigger denominations than that, but happy to hand around fake money, the money that you see De Niro handing around on the set of Goodfellas is the real stuff. So when he's handing out a massive tip to someone, that's real money that he's passing to them. And as you might expect, it was someone's job on the set of the film that once cut had been called to go and get all of that real money back. It was a summer shoot in a hot New York City and a hot New York State that wrapped up on August the 9th, 1989. And it was, Warner Brothers at this stage was it was transforming, because that summer, as Goodfellas was wrapping up production, Batman had happened. And the expectations of what a movie could do at the box office and how quickly it could do it were being absolutely turned on its head. And so by the time Warner Brothers came into 1990, its view of what movies could do, in fact, the whole broader Hollywood ecosystem had just been slightly skewed. And here was this $25 million gangster picture that was, in its mind, going to be a really, really tough sell. Because certainly the post-production had its challenges. From Scorsese's point of view, he had a reasonable amount of time to find the film. And he was as deliberate as you would expect in doing so. When I say find the film, I mean find the final cut. I mean, he knew what he was doing going into the movie, as evidenced by the fact that he'd identified the soundtrack that holds the film together years really before he actually got to the set. That, as he told High Beam, the tunes that he picked had to at least vaguely comment on the scene or characters, and they had to be chronologically appropriate to the time the scenes were set in. There are a lot of setup and scenes in Goodfellas as well when you watch it back, and Scorsese was really precise in where he was placing his music in the midst of it. Now, the other wizard behind the scenes of Goodfellas was Thelma Schoonmaker, Scorsese's longtime editor and collaborator, whose work on Goodfellas is very much amongst her best. And as Tom Sean would describe, it took Scorsese and Schumacher right back to their early days cutting documentaries together when making Goodfellas, that they were using techniques such as slow motion, fast motion. They would stop for a freeze frame. They would just diligently place the voiceover. They would be willing just to pull the rug, really, whenever we needed it. And they fashioned a final cut of the film, the first that was, a first cut really, that was screened for Warner Brothers, that was running to 175 minutes long. And Warner Brothers was worried about this for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was 175 minutes long. But the second reason was that two scenes in particular were troubling the studio given the level of violence that was being portrayed on screen. Now, the irony of Goodfellas is you don't actually, it's regarded as a hugely violent film. You don't actually see that many people meet their maker on screen. There's a lot of implication in there. But there are moments, there's an early sequence in that 175-minute cut that involved a stabbing that was particularly brutal. I'm going relatively spoiler light, but there's the death of one character that is very, very stark, involving Joe Pesci. And Warner Brothers was concerned about that. Almost the casualness and the fact that it was played for laughs was really kind of raising alarm bells in the executive suites of Warner Brothers. So Scorsese got to work and he cut back the stabbing sequence at the start, but left the particular character death I described before. And he pulled the film back to 146 minutes, which just about got the nod from Warner Brothers. It was shown, incidentally, to Henry Hill, who would reflect of the finished film, which had to cut out some of the more extreme parts of Pileggi's book as well, even before it got to script stage, that the world that Scorsese had put on screen was about 95% there. And also because the book had been published first, it had done a lot of the legal clearance work. So a lot of the names are fairly close to reality. Now, contrast that with the film that Pileggi and Scorsese made a little bit down the line, Casino. In the case of Casino, the film came first, not the book that it's said to ultimately be based on. And what that meant is it was incumbent on the studio to do the legal clearances for Casino. And whilst there were legal clearances required for Goodfellas, in Casino, it got to the point where they changed a lot more names, and even the geography of places they were a lot vaguer on because, well, basically the burden was more on their shoulders with that. When it got to a point that a cut was ready, that all concerned were at least ready to put in front of some kind of audience, well, the problems began to mount again. Because this was a studio film and studios like to test screen their movies, and the test screening process on Goodfellas was pretty brutal, that there were stories of a broken print, that a screening that just basically didn't work, of Scorsese just going away from a screening and not wanting to go back. And there's one description from Tom Sean about when Warner Brothers put on a screening in Southern California, around 70 people walked out. And Scorsese would say they thought it was an outrage that I'd made these people, these mobsters, look so attractive. And he also said a lot of the preview audience were agitated by the last day sequence of the film, but I argued that they should be agitated. But already you were getting signs of just what the response was going to be. And to get just a further voice on this, I did a podcast special episode with the producer of Goodfellas, Barbara DeFina, a little while ago. And here's what she had to say on the response initially to the film.
Nick's script was very tight and very good.
Yeah.
And he knows that world. He lived that world. And I think, and after Color of Money, obviously they wanted to make that movie.
Yeah.
It was very dark. Warner's I think at one point they didn't quite know what to make of it because it was so dark and yet funny.
Yeah.
And the audiences, it was interesting when we had the previews, the audiences didn't quite understand. They were having fun and people were doing sort of bad things, but they're still having fun. And then we got to the point where Spider got shot.
Yeah.
And they put the guy's head in the pizza oven and stuff, and all of a sudden it wasn't funny anymore, and so the whole tone shifted, and it was a very it wasn't something that the audience was used to. I mean, today they are, but at that point I think it was strange to them.
It wasn't just tonally strange to those test audiences either, because unsurprisingly, the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA, well, it wasn't best pleased with the movie either. The level of violence was agitating it a lot, and there was a real chance that Goodfellas wouldn't get the rating it needed to play in US cinemas. It needed to come out with an R rating. Otherwise, the vast majority of US cinemas just weren't going to show it. The video stores wouldn't stock it, and it would be commercial suicide for the film had it got a harsher rating. In the end, it was the Warner Brothers top brass themselves just went to the MPAA and intervened and had conversations. And Scorsese tweaked the film as well. He was doing very, very minor edits to try and get the MPAA back on side. And eventually he got approval for a cut that Scorsese would be able to take to the Venice Film Festival, ironically enough, on September the 9th, 1990. Now, the box office of 1990 hadn't been wonderful for Warner Brothers. It had a big summer hope in Gremlins 2, The New Batch, which I'm coming to in a future episode, that just hadn't delivered at all, really. And the story goes that when it came to the release of Goodfellas, it just cut the screen count down a little bit. It didn't go absolutely as huge as it could, opening it in, just over 1,000 cinemas rather than 2,000, as you might have expected. Scorsese had brought it in on that $25 million budget, and it went in front of critics with Warner Brothers really expecting the film just to be on the flop side. Or at the very least, it was expecting it to do just about okay. It kind of didn't really know what it was about to have, because the reviews for the film, appreciating there were one or two outliers who responded badly to the violence and weren't that keen, on the whole, the reviews for the film were absolutely ecstatic, and rightly so, that at the point it was released, I mean, Roger Ebert, for instance, was one of the most influential critics of all time, I'd argue, was straight out the traps, arguing that it was even better than The Godfather to some degree. And it was rave reviews. It was getting along right down the line. It was coming top of people's. It would be coming top of people's top 10 films of the year list. And Warner Brothers all of a sudden had this film that it had pegged for a release in the US on September the 19th, 1990, that was getting some of the best reviews of the year. Would that translate into box office gold, though? Well, the answer to that is no, not really, but we're just about okay. That it did open in first place at the American box office, but it opened in first place with $6.3 million. Now, by 1990 standards, that wasn't awful. That was perfectly fine. And Warner Brothers had a late summer hit with Presumed Innocent that was still around the top 10 as well anyway. Goodfellas was the only major opener that weekend, but we also got small openings for The Boyfriend School, never heard of it. The Tall Guy, certainly have heard of it. And Miller's Crossing opened on one screen to a huge screen average. Number 2 to Goodfellas was Postcards from the Edge. Then there was Ghost. Narrow Margin and Funny About Love did actually open that weekend as well, but just weren't doing much business. Death Warrant in the top 10, Flatliners, Darkman, I've covered that before, and Hardware in there too. And it was the kind of point in the box office calendar where you were halfway between the Oscar films and the big summer films that had just gone. The following week, Goodfellas was knocked off the top of the chart fairly quickly by Pacific Heights, thriller starring Michael Keaton and Melanie Griffiths that I've covered before. But it only lost 7.7% of its business. It was holding. There was word of mouth at work here. And there was already talk that, you know what, this might have something of an Oscar run for it. That Goodfellas would drop out of the top 10 in just over a month or so, and its US box office run was 46.9 million, which Warner Brothers was pretty happy with, really. It wasn't doing great guns overseas. This wasn't a film that was earning tons of international box office, but a good Oscar run could make a hell of a lot of difference to it. And I'm not really a surprise, really, when you consider the film. It was right in the midst of the Academy Award considerations that it got nominated for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actor, Best Supporting Actress. The screenplay got nominated, Best Editing as well. It walked away from the Oscars with just one prize, Best Supporting Actor for Joe Pesci, who memorably gave one of the shortest acceptance speeches in Oscar history. Look it up on YouTube. It's on there. It won't take you long to watch at all. But the particular Oscars that Goodfellas struggled at, it came up against a film I like an awful lot, but I still would. I mean, Goodfellas clearly should have won pretty much everything. It was Dances with Wolves that took the bulk of the prizes. Now, a lot of the critics associations gave the film Best Film awards. Los Angeles did, New York did, the Venice Film Festival gave Scorsese Best Director, the Boston Critics Best Film, Chicago Critics Best Film. You go right down the line, and there were a lot of people who were praising it very quickly. But it's a film that didn't go absolutely nuts right at the start, and it didn't quite get the awards attention it did. What's been incredible about Goodfellas is the sheer endurance of it, and the fact that many, many years, I mean, at the point this has been recorded, we're over 30 years since it was released, it remains one of the most watchable and rewatchable films of its type. And you know what? Roger Ebert called it right. It is right there in the conversation of The Godfather as well. I'm going to leave the final word on this, it seems appropriate, to the producer of the film. I'm going to just bring back Barbara DeFina just to sum up her particular feelings on the response to Goodfellas.
I think it hit at the right time. I think nobody expected it to.
Yeah.
I think it got more and more, people loved it like a year or so after.
Yeah.
I mean, when it first opened, I think people were like not quite sure what it was. But in the years that have passed, people have loved the movie. And there is some, you know, I don't often watch movies that I've made more than but there's something about when Goodfellas comes on that it's very engaging for some reason. I don't know what it is.
Well, it might just be that it's a modern masterpiece. And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. Just a couple of parish notices before we move on to the second half of this particular episode. First of all, if you like this podcast, there are 3 ways that you can support it in particular, short of listening to it. I'm really glad you listened to it. But if I could persuade you to subscribe to it at your podcast home of choice, that would be massively appreciated. Likewise, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, that would be nice as well. It really helps independent podcasts such as this one. And if you really like this podcast and really like the Film Stories project, then you can financially support us at Patreon, patreon.com/Simon Brew. If you head there and put some money in the pot, then you get the podcast early, pretty much every week, and you also get it ad-free, and you find the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes as well. That's patreon.com/Simon Brew. If you head meanwhile to store.filmstories.co.uk, at the point this is being recorded, we're just signing off the 44th issue of Film Stories magazine, which we're leading with a huge interview with Emily Blunt. Really proud of that as well. That's at store.filmstories.co.uk, the latest issue, 100 pages, all the back issues there as well, including back issues of our Film Junior magazine too. But that's it for the parish notices. I'm going to move now to a slightly unusual for me second half of the episode, in that I had the opportunity to talk to a pair of filmmakers about a range of films, and I kind of snapped their arms off, really. So what you're going to hear next for the second half of this episode is a conversation I had at the junket for Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny with its producers, Kathleen Kennedy and Frank Marshall. Now, Kathleen Kennedy is now the head of Lucasfilm, as I'm sure most of you know. Frank Marshall is a producer and director. He's been on this podcast before talking about his Bee Gees documentary, which I briefly touch on. Just a few notes before we head into this conversation. We talk about a few things in here. So we talk about a man called Jeffrey Katzenberg briefly. He was heading up the movie side of Disney in the 90s and late 80s. Notoriously a bit frugal, really, but his name comes up as a Hollywood executive who they used to do business with, in particular in relation to a film I mentioned called Noises Off, an early 1990s movie directed by Peter Bogdanovich. It's fairly self-explanatory once we get into that. I talked briefly about Jurassic Park 3 and the rumoured story that the script to that was torn up fairly late in the day when Joe Johnston took over from directing that from Steven Spielberg as originally planned. And I mentioned the groundbreaking deal that was done for the original Raiders of the Lost Ark when George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, the architects of that film, cut a deal with Paramount Pictures that was unheard of at the time, that gave them a slice of the profits from the movie and gave them creative control over it. I introduced the film too. You won't see this because it's audio, of course. I'm against a backdrop of the film Congo, which I love a lot, directed by Frank Marshall. When I mentioned The Lost City of Zinj, that is a reference to Congo. They mentioned the name Jim at one point as well. That is the director of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, which is in cinemas just as this has been released. That man's name is James Mangold. I've recorded a separate episode with him, which is available now. I'm going to set this up with a clip from Indiana Jones, The Dial of Destiny, and then straight after that, you'll hear my conversation with Kathleen Kennedy and Frank Marshall.
You stole it. Then you stole it.
And then I stole it. It's called capitalism.
This way!
Fasten your seatbelts. There might be some turbulence.
You've taken your chances, made your mistakes. Now, a final triumph.
Indy! Give him hell, Indiana Jones!
A few times in my life, I've seen things. I've been tortured with voodoo. Been shot 9 times, including once by your father.
Sorry!
But I've been looking for this all my life.
A big hello then to Kathleen Kennedy and Frank Marshall. Hello.
Hello.
Can we start in the only logical place to begin with 1992's Noises Off? Which I've just picked that up on Blu-ray, and I was just reading, like in the last week, and I'm just reading through the credits. Both of you two are on this.
Yes.
So was this the Peter Bogdanovich era, presumably? So both of you, I know, Frank, you had quite a background working there. I didn't know you were on this one as well, Kathleen.
Yeah.
I mean, can you just give me
He overshadows me most of the time.
Is that how it works? Interesting. I'm not here to provide counselling, but I can give it a go. But can you give me a story of working with Peter Bogdanovich? Sorry, I know that's a weird place to start, but what
No, it's not a weird place to start. One of our favorite projects, and obviously the person to speak to that is Frank, because you made 9 movies.
Yes.
And
yeah, and it was this all came from Peter. He loved the play, and as you know, he also loves screwball comedies, and he got together this fantastic cast.
Yeah.
And the challenge obviously was that in the live theater, everything's happening in front of you, and that's what makes it funny, is the timing. So how do you do that on screen and continue, so because your eye gets fooled by a cut. So Peter was trying to find out how to do everything in one shot every time, which was a challenge. And we had was the beginning days of this thing called a Luma crane that started to be used. And I introduced him to the Luma crane, which he completely fell in love with, because he could do everything and follow people around the set. And that's what made it so fun and so funny, I think.
I also think, I have a distinct memory, Simon, when because we did the movie for Disney.
Yes.
Which is ironic. I'd forgotten.
Yeah.
So we actually made several movies for Disney they wouldn't make today, but we ended up with a 245-page script. And I remember Jeffrey Katzenberg, and this is a testament to Jeffrey. He was like, there's no way you can make this movie with a 245-page script. And Peter was the one who said, absolutely, I have timed this movie. I will make this movie for under 2 hours in length, and you cannot touch the script. It's everything to do with the rhythm of the script. And I remember being absolutely fascinated. I'm still fascinated by how that worked, because you hold the proscenium and let the action happen within the frame, and the dialogue and the overlapping dialogue amongst all the characters was fundamental to the rhythm of that movie. So kind of incredible, because today, if you handed a 245-page script to a studio executive, they would never greenlight the movie.
No, because when you time the normal timing of the script is a minute a page,
unless it's Aaron Sorkin. I think he's the only exception, isn't he?
Yeah. Yeah.
So are we saying, are we concluding that we're going to remake Noises Off and get Aaron Sorkin to write it? And I mean, Jeffrey Katzenberg, for old time's sake, he'd come along. He'd love stuff like that.
Yes, he would. He would.
I know when I'm supposed to interview you two, I'm supposed to ask all these clickbait questions about when I'm getting a new Indiana Jones, a new Star Wars, and a new Jurassic Park film. So I apologize in advance, because I've got no intention of asking those. I hope I don't get into trouble for that.
Thank you.
But I am curious, Indiana Jones specific, about the custodian nature of it. That it's a slightly obvious question, but I'm just curious from the perspective of two human beings in the midst of all of this, that there's always been these two authors. I mean, growing up, I was always told that unless George Lucas said yes to a story, you're not making an Indiana Jones film. And, books have been written about how many unmade Indiana Jones films there are. And it's just like you, in the nicest sense, it strikes me you two have become the grown-ups in the room. I just wonder if you kind of get a sense of that with that. I mean, what's the eureka moment that's just like, oh, all right, we'll make an Indiana Jones film? Because the external pressure seems enormous.
The external pressure is enormous, but I think also you can't take away the fact that we've all been together for a long time. We're essentially a family in that way. And from that, there develops an incredible amount of trust. And I think that that's had a great deal to do with how the process is unfolded. Yeah. I also would say in the case of this film, it had everything to do with Harrison. Yeah. Harrison very much wanted to do another movie. He didn't necessarily know what it would be about, but he knew it when he would see it. And he kept saying that, I'll know it. And I knew in the
Interesting.
process, and I think Frank would agree, that we weren't going to make this movie without Harrison being 100% on board. And so that was really fundamentally the eureka moment, was when Harrison read this script, and when Jim had stepped in and they had a working relationship already that was very good, that there was a real eureka moment where he was, yeah, this is it. This is what I want to do. I see it. I believe it. It has something to say. It meant something personally to him because of the theme of time. I think that was really fundamental. So yeah, that was the eureka moment.
But there's an old Hitchcock adage, I think it's Hitchcock as well, that your next film is kind of informed by the one before. And I always thought that, say, I mean, going Indiana Jones specific, the fact that you put us all through childhood trauma on Temple of Doom and left us all requiring extensive amounts of therapy led to a kind of lighter Last Crusade. But I don't know whether that's true or not, but I'm just curious if there's any connective tissue to it, that if you do respond from one film to another, or do you treat them entirely standalone?
Well, I think it all depends. Indiana Jones was always conceived of as the kind of serialization of standalone stories with a character that went from one movie to the next, unlike what George was trying to do with Star Wars, which was an ongoing story, as opposed to necessarily carrying on, you know, an individual character. So I think with Indy, that was very much the case, that Harrison and the character of Indiana Jones was definitely being informed by the movie that preceded it. There's no question.
And the structure, I think, the structure being based on serials, that first 15, 20 minutes is the end of the serial before, which is a cliffhanger, and then leads to what we would say the present day movie is. That was always on purpose.
So you can kind of tell the truth here, right? You two are highly powered Hollywood people with billions of dollars at your fingertips. If someone came to you now with the deal that was asked for on the original Raiders, the creative control, the slice of the box office gross and stuff like that, just be honest, would you say yes? Because
I would. I don't know that the studios would, but I would. I'm a believer in that. I actually think, I don't know. I think when people invest this kind of time and energy and hard work, that sharing in success should be a part of the process. I believe that. I think that makes
anyone
sense.
listening, we should all send our scripts your way now with a demand for 20% of the first dollar gross. Got it. See, I'm clickbaiting as I go now. Let's go. One of the nice things about being a film fan and reading about all things from the outside, and it's just fascinating from my point of view. But I remember the closest parallel I can think of with what you went through on this was Jurassic Part 3, which is a hugely entertaining tale for me to read, but it sounds like absolute hell for you. That the moment where Steven Spielberg says he doesn't want to make it, in comes another director. And I've got that the story on Jurassic Part 3 was you ditched the entire script weeks before you were due to start filming this hugely expensive film, and you went through all the stresses on that. And first of all, is there any truth to that? And second of all, do you kind of think it's healthy, just like the interest, like sad, nerdy people like me sitting in the West Midlands, taking kind of that behind the scenes level of detail in making films?
Oh, that's very loaded, Simon.
I'm not trying to do that, actually.
No. I just mean there's a lot of things you're asking.
Right, okay.
It's first of all, I would just say for us, there's nothing more important than the script.
Yeah.
So we would never ditch a script and then start shooting a movie.
Yeah.
That is not true. I don't know where that has come from.
It's on the internet. It must be true.
Pardon?
It's on the internet. It must be true.
Yeah, it is kind of it's amusing, frankly, at times. I'm always amazed at how creative people get online with the things they think happened. But
hold that thought.
Yeah.
And making movies all about the preparation.
Yes.
So I'm not going to throw a script out and start with a new one and be ready to shoot.
Yeah.
So that doesn't make any sense.
No, and there was nothing more complicated than making the Jurassic Park movies. I mean, that's constant. And, at the time we had Michael Crichton around with us, who truly a genius. And
Joe wasn't a surprise.
And Joe was not a surprise.
Part of ILM.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know where any of that came from, Simon.
It's print the legend though, isn't it? That's
Yeah.
proper old school Hollywood, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
I just wonder if these stories kind of steamroll. And I know you've been in the crosshairs of them, and I'm not trying to lead you down there at all.
Oh, no. It's
I have been reading old interviews a couple of you have done though, and so I mean, Frank, for instance, I read an interview you gave from the set of Alive, which I went to watch when I should have been revising for exams, but I passed the exam, so I'm not blaming you for that. And you talked about just shooting Alive being the toughest challenge of your 25-year career. And then Kathleen, I saw an interview that you gave when you came onto ET, and I didn't appreciate you just come straight from principal photography on Raiders immediately onto prepping ET. I'm just kind of wondering, now you look back at some of those incredible experiences you've had making film, does it always feel a little bit surreal just with that? Because I look back at things I did in my 20s, for instance, I just couldn't imagine even doing them now.
It is a little surreal because I actually appreciate the spontaneity.
Yeah.
I feel that, we get more cautious the older we get.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was getting it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's true. And I think trying to regain that sense of spontaneity is something I'm always looking for and I appreciate. So yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, what was your question?
Well, I'm just kind of curious about it all, really, that if you look back at the stuff that you used to do, which if you wrote it down, it just looks impossible. But yeah, I mean, almost the naivety of it is just bliss.
I spend so much time looking ahead that I don't right now spend too much time trying to look back. But yeah, when you catch yourself and you realize that it's usually somebody else.
Yeah.
Saying something that makes you suddenly reflect on what it is you did that I think feels that way. But...
And I'd say that in 50 years of making movies now, that's still the hardest production that I've ever done. And I was directing it, so it was really hard. But we would helicopter in every day.
I've just been reading this.
And the equipment every single day. So it would take 2 hours just to get started up on this glacier. You would never do that today.
There's something joyful about the fact that you did it, though.
Yeah.
No, it was joyful.
We had a blast every day.
People say to us, oh my God, that must have been grueling. And the two of us are always like, well, it was really difficult and really challenging, but there was a joyfulness every single day to be on the top of this glacier in the middle of nature with these challenges in real time that we had to solve constantly to figure out how we were going to continue to shoot. Great cast.
Telling a hopeful story, a story
about
human spirit. And we had Nando there the whole time, which when you think about it, he's still a great friend of ours.
Yeah.
And he stops by to see us, and just that joy of life that we had made that experience unlike any other we've had, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I my other memory of you around that time, Frank, is you giving a press tour for Arachnophobia and trying to pretend there were no spiders in it, which I found insanely entertaining. Must have been hell for you, but I mean, joyful from where I was sitting.
Yeah.
Can I talk about duty of care as producers? And again, I'm not setting traps here, just to be clear. I'm just you've got the weight of Indiana Jones, you've got the weight of the expectation of Indiana Jones, and you're bringing a fresh face into it. And I've been reading some fascinating chats with James Mangold about him not really playing by the rules of franchise filmmaking, but I'm still kind of conscious you're bringing a fresh face into something that's absolutely in full glaring bleak, the full beam of the world. I'm just curious, you talked about preparation before, for instance, and about making sure things are in place. And Kathleen, you gave an interview just ahead of Force Awakens where you talked about taking the time with J.J. Abrams just so he could be sure what the impact was on his life. Is it the same kind of parallel here? I mean, is that duty of care now one of the most important things for a producer?
I think it is. I think it really is for a number of the young women that come into the experiences with us. It's something we talk a lot about, and we make sure that they're surrounded by people who they trust and can help them navigate, because we're in a time where people can say some really hateful things.
Yeah.
And that's, it's disturbing to people who are experienced and have been in the business a long time. It's devastating for people who are just starting a career and actually, have that feeling that it's ending before it even started. And so in this case, Jim was pretty seasoned. And he's, if anything, I think once you get to the place where Jim is, where he's a self-assured filmmaker, storyteller, the tough thing is to try to say, don't feel like you have to respond to everything.
Yeah.
It's sort of the opposite of somebody who's just starting out and just feels like they want to crawl into a hole and disappear.
Hopefully, Frank, you're once you finish making, I really enjoyed your Bee Gees documentary. Once you finish making documentaries, you will crack on with Indiana Jones and the Lost City of Zinj, which is the crossover. I think I'm sure everyone on these interviews has asked you on this endless press tour that you're doing.
Good clickbait, Simon.
I think so. I've got this absolutely nailed. But one of the things we use our platform for is trying to show a way in, really, to film for people who feel that film isn't for them. So I wonder if I can ask you two hugely powerful people, really. I mean, do you think the paths that you followed into the industry still exist? And is there kind of a message you would send to the person who perhaps is listening to this, who feels that their story doesn't matter? And I know it's like the smallest possible question, but it's probably the most important one for me, if you'll indulge me on it.
I don't think there's an identical path.
Yeah.
I think part of it is the stakes are too high. That's changed. When Frank started, they were making movies, whether it was Target's Last Picture Show, Paper Moon, for under $2 million. Even when I stepped in to finally produce, E.T. was 10. And now, it's tenfold that, with certainly these big event movies and even the smaller movies. The tough thing nowadays is, can you even get it seen on the big screen? And I know both of us feel that that's incredibly important, because for all of us who love movies, COVID taught us once again that the minute you step back into a movie theater and you're actually sitting back and enjoying something on the big screen, there's nothing like it. Yeah. It's not television. Television is something very different. And I think for people, certainly young people who come in to company with us and want to work in film, it's challenging now. Because they can take out their iPhone. This is the thing everybody says, oh, you can make whatever you want on the iPhone, but you can't get distribution for that.
Yeah.
Where it used to be that you could literally get your hands on a 35 millimeter camera or a 16 millimeter camera, and there was the potential for distribution. And I don't know if that exists today. Would you?
Yeah, I have to agree. I don't think there is a path like we had. We were incredibly lucky and sort of came into the business at a time when it was kind of exploding creatively and
huge opportunities.
And there are all these opportunities. And I would say, though, that if you are fortunate enough to work as a PA or as a runner or whatever on a film, always do your best, because you never know who's watching. And that's how my break happened with Mr. Spielberg, that I didn't know it, but 5 years before he told George Lucas on the beach that he wanted to see if he could find me to produce Raiders, he had seen me work in Rome on Daisy Miller. And he had turned to Werner Field and say, that's the kind of guy I need, a guy who's more interested in the next shot than lunch. So you never know what's happening. Make the best coffee, collate the pages right.
I'm with you on the coffee.
Yeah, or tea. I'm sorry.
No, not tea.
Where I
Not
was.
tea.
Make the best tea. Although Kathy didn't make very good tea,
No,
according
I
to
didn't
Stephen's story.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your time.
That's great.
Thanks,
Thank you, Simon.
I'm
See
off
you.
to watch Noises Off now. Take care.
Excellent.
Love it.
Okay.
And that brings to an end my conversation with Kathleen Kennedy and Frank Marshall. You'll notice also we touched on the movie Alive in there, which I'm saving also for a future episode of this podcast to go into more detail too. It also brings to an end this episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you so much for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can get more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can get more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories. We're at Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online. You can find us hiding on YouTube at youtube.com/Film Stories. And then our website is filmstories.co.uk. Our online shop is store.filmstories.co.uk. And that Patreon again is patreon.com/Simon Brew. Just to reiterate, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is playing in cinemas around the world just as this podcast is being released. So you might want to trot off and go and see that. For now, I'm off to watch more films and write more episodes of this podcast. As always, the most important thing is you all stay safe and well. I thank you for listening. I thank you for your time. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Take care and bye-bye.